Holders of that debt don't get their money back. Boom, the claims get diminished. In this instance, if the future isn't large enough to pay back the claims, then defaults are simply a way of not paying them back. The inflation route can be confusing, so think of it this way. What if you sold your house to someone and elected to hold a note for $500,000? The terms call for the note to be repaid all at once in 10 years as a single payment of $650,000. Well, what if you get paid your $650,000 right on time? But that $650,000 will only buy this house. You got paid all right, but your claim on the future was vastly diminished by inflation. In the default scenario, your money is still worth something, but you don't get it back. In the inflation scenario, you get it back, but it hardly buys anything. In both cases, your future was diminished, so the impact is very nearly the same, but the means of achieving it are wildly different. So the questions you need to ponder for yourself are, have too many claims been made on the future? And if so, will we face inflation or defaults as the means of squaring things up? You will arrive at wildly different life decisions depending on whether you answer yes or no to the first question and inflation or defaults to the second question. So they are worth pondering. All right, here's what we learned. Key concept number 6. Debt is a claim on future human labor. Second, per capita debt has never been higher. We are in truly unprecedented territory in this country. Debt has increased by $16 trillion in the past 5 years, and most of it consumptive debt. This means that future consumption will have to be seriously curtailed or will enter a period of debt destruction, either by defaults or inflation. And finally, key concept number 7. Our debt markets assume that the future will be much larger than the present. Our entire economic system, and by extension our way of life, is founded on debt. And debt is founded on the assumption that the future will always be bigger than the past. Therefore, it is utterly vital that we examine this assumption closely, because if this assumption is false, so are a lot of other things we may be taking for granted. All right, we are done. I'll see you next time. But when we get to the federal government, that's when the scary numbers emerge. David Walker, the recently retired comptroller of the U.S. and a personal hero of mine, said of the U.S. government, "Its financial position is worse than advertised. It has a broken business model. It faces deficits in its budget, its balance of payments, its savings, and its leadership." Wow, those are some pretty strong words. In my assessment, he's absolutely right. And here's some data to support that. This is a table taken right from the U.S. government annual report found on the Treasury Department website. Again, we are going to be looking at NPV numbers. The first is a nearly $9 trillion shortfall representing the total U.S. government net position, without including Social Security and Medicare. Again, this means that all U.S. government cash inflows, plus the value of all government assets, would have to be offset against known outlays to determine that, today, the U.S. government would have to somehow obtain $8.9 trillion to balance its liabilities against its assets. But that's not even the 1/5 of it. Once we add in Social Security and Medicare, the shortfall suddenly balloons to $53 trillion by the Treasury Department's own calculations. Whoa, stop right there. That's more than 4 times GDP. This means that the U.S. government is insolvent. Why is this not topic number 1 on the presidential campaign trail? A country this far in hock has some real future issues and is potentially on its way to bankruptcy. In case you are harboring the notion that there's some money socked away in a special U.S. government account, like a lockbox, this picture shows George Bush standing next to the entire Social Security Trust Fund. Yep, there it is. The entire trust fund is a 3-ring binder with slips of paper in it saying that the U.S. government has spent all the money and replaced it with special treasury bonds. Hold on there. Aren't treasury bonds an obligation of the U.S. government? How can the government owe itself money? It can't. All government revenue either comes from taxpayers or borrowing. So when the time comes to pay off those special bonds, that money will either come from taxpayers or additional borrowing. If it were possible to owe money to yourself and pay interest to boot, then we could all become fabulously wealthy by writing ourselves checks. But, of course, this is a foolish, easily dispelled notion. At any rate, depending on which government agency's numbers you use, the federal shortfall is anywhere from $53 trillion to $85 trillion. This number is so large that it even scares small monkeys, and proving the point that you cannot grow your way out of an NPV shortfall, this number has grown by nearly $40 trillion over the past 10 years, advancing during both strong and weak economic times. And finally, saving is related to investing, and according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we've fallen short there as well. In 2005, they assessed the condition of 12 categories of infrastructure, including bridges, roadways, drinking water systems, and wastewater treatment plants. They gave the U.S. an overall grade of D and calculated that $1.6 trillion would be needed over the next 5 years to bring us back up to first world standards. Since that was in 2005, and inflation for things made out of metal and asphalt has advanced enormously since then, let's just round that up to, say, an even $2 trillion. Putting it all together, we find that a personal failure to save is reflected by a state and local failure to save, which are themselves mirrored by a corporate failure to save, all dwarfed by a failure to save at the federal government level. And capping it all off is a profound failure to invest. All of these deficits lie before us and lead me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. This is our legacy, the economic and physical world that we are choosing to leave to those who follow us. How did we get here? How did this happen? Next, we move on to assets to see how they stack up against our debts and our national failure to save. The same dynamic is true for other assets as well. Sufficient buyers are essential, or the wealth is as good as stranded. I mentioned that there are also two big oversights in the Household Wealth Report, and the first is that the Fed mysteriously does not include the general liabilities of the government when calculating household net wealth. Wouldn't it make sense for the Fed to offset these against household wealth? After all, who else besides the taxpayers living in households are going to pay off those liabilities? Nobody. That's who. If the Fed did perform this offset, household net worth would plunge below zero. So I can guess why this comparison is never made. The second oversight is that the data is presented as if it applied to our entire country in a fairly even and useful manner. It does not. The top 1% owns 35% of all net household wealth, and, looking at stocks only, owns 56% of all stock by value. If you can't see it, I apologize. The top 1% is represented by a very thin red smear at the top of that column there. It's great that our stock market keeps powering higher, but for every $1 trillion it goes up, 560 billion of that goes to only 1 out of 100 households. The top 20%, which includes the top 1%, owns 85% of all household net wealth and 80% of all stocks by value. This means that the bottom 80% of the citizens of this country, represented in yellow, holds only 15% of the total wealth of this country. Remember, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More immediately, this tells us that our credit crisis is going to be worse than advertised. Just as was true of the wealth gap in the late 1920s, before the onset of the Great Depression, the severity of the crisis will not depend on average wealth, but on the distribution of the wealth. If a large swath of the population lacks the means to weather the storm, then that storm will be longer and harsher than otherwise would be the case. So what does it mean that 80% of our population possesses a meager 15% of the total wealth? For one thing, it means that recent efforts by the Fed to provide massive amounts of liquidity to support the biggest and wealthiest banks at the inflationary expense of the lower classes were not only misguided, but they were cruel and unusual. This leads to an easy prediction to make. The wealth gap in the United States will hamper our recovery and deepen the downturn. In order to really understand why I have been harping on this notion of assets being variable and their value being dependent on the ratio of buyers to sellers, we'll need to take a quick trip into demographics. Recall that the U.S. government has not saved in any of its entitlement programs, and that it has a massive shortfall in them, measuring in the tens of trillions of dollars. That situation comes about because the entitlement programs are really wealth transfer programs, not savings accounts, and so they depend on a significant surplus of current workers to retirees. The shortfalls in these programs are being exacerbated by a troubling trend. In 1950, there were 7 workers per retiree, and the system was balanced. By 2005, that ratio had dropped to only 5 to 1, and the system was already exhibiting signs of distress. By 2030, that ratio will have plummeted to a thoroughly unworkable value of less than 3 to 1. And this trend comes about as a feature of the so-called baby boom. This is a demographic chart of the United States, and each bar represents a clustering of all the people who are within a 5-year wide age window, as seen on the left axis. The baby boomers number around 75 million strong and roughly occupy these 4 bands. While it may not seem like much, the hole that exists in the population behind the baby boomers represents an enormous challenge and even threat to our entitlement programs and will greatly complicate our efforts to resolve our levels of debt and our national failure to save. A more normal population distribution, if you will, and the kind that humans evolved with over countless millennia, looks like this: a pyramid. Again, this shows 5-year wide age brackets with men in red and women in yellow. This distribution is capable of supporting an entitlement program such as the one in the U.S. that is based on transferring wealth directly from workers to retirees. But when we cast this chart forward to 2000, the baby boomer bulge is quite apparent. Besides the challenge that this demographic profile offers to the entitlement programs, an even larger challenge is presented to both the debt and savings issues I painted in previous chapters, and even to the value of our assets. Here's what I mean. The boomers are the wealthiest generation ever. They hold nearly all of the assets, and they will need to dispose of those assets to fund their retirements. Who exactly are the boomers planning on selling their assets to? This guy? Even if his generation somehow could afford to buy all these assets, there simply aren't enough people in his generation to buy them. In order to fund their retirement dreams, boomers are going to have to sell off their assets. And again, we might wonder, to whom exactly? And lastly, if the massive accumulation of debt over the past 23 years was predicated on the assumption that the future will be much larger than the present, we might also question how exactly that will come to pass if boomers are retiring en masse and there are fewer behind them to take their place. Man, the next generation better be prepared to work really, really hard. Too bad they're graduating with the highest levels of college debt ever recorded. This sort of demographic profile will be with us for decades and cannot be wished away or fixed by some clever policy. It is simply a fact of life, and one that we do well to recognize and plan for rather than ignore. Boomer retirement has already begun, and the pace of this will accelerate rapidly over the next 15 years, which will make the 20-teens quite interesting, and leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. Next time, we're going to discuss asset bubbles. Understanding the destructive dynamics of bubbles is critical if you want to know what's coming next and why the Federal Reserve is panicking right now. Remember, a bubble exists when asset price inflation rises beyond what incomes can sustain. And that's exactly what we see in this chart. So where was the Fed during all of this? Well, they were busy writing research papers convincing themselves that there was no housing bubble, as seen in this 2004 Fed study entitled, "Are Home Prices the Next Bubble?" The main summary of the study started off on a good note, stating, home prices have been rising strongly since the mid-1990s, prompting concerns that a bubble exists in this asset class and that home prices are vulnerable to a collapse that could harm the U.S. economy. But then the main conclusion of the paper veered sharply off into a ditch, reading, "A close analysis of the U.S. housing market in recent years, however, finds little basis for such concerns. The marked upturn in home prices is largely attributable to strong market fundamentals. Home prices have essentially moved in line with increases in family income and declines in nominal mortgage interest rates." Essentially moved in line with increases in family income? What? One of the most widely known facts of our time is that family incomes did not move up at all on an inflation-adjusted basis during the housing boom, and is one of the principal economic failures of the first decade of the millennium. This just goes to show that the Federal Reserve is either stocked with inept or biased researchers, and of the two, I'm not sure which makes me feel worse about our chances of safely navigating through this mess. But the Fed's researchers were simply doing what millions of people did, namely, falling prey to believing that somehow, this time it's different. But that's just how bubbles are. People take leave of their senses, use all manner of rationales to justify their positions, but then, suddenly, one day the illusion lifts, and what seemed to be unassailably true no longer makes any sense at all. Once that day happens, the fate of the bubble is reduced to measuring the speed of its collapse. While it's tempting to lay the blame for what's happening on the housing bubble, it's important to remember that the dramatic rise in house prices was itself just a symptom of a credit bubble run amok. Total credit at the end of 2000, when the stock bubble was bursting, stood at $27 trillion. By the end of 2007, it stood at an astounding $48 trillion. This $21 trillion increase in borrowing is 5 times larger than the increase in U.S. GDP over the same period of time. Any attempt to understand the housing bubble has to be viewed against the backdrop of this massive increase in debt. But as we noted in an earlier chapter, this credit bubble has been going on for 25 years. Unwinding a multi-generational debt binge is going to require some enormous changes in attitudes and habits. One reason that any bubble, but especially a housing bubble like this one, is so destructive is because so many bad investments are made along the way. Too many houses were built, too many shopping centers, and too many condos, and nearly all of them too large and ill-positioned for a future of expensive energy. Sorry to say, but all those trillions of dollars were wasted, and worse, stole opportunities from the things that needed money more. The Austrian School of Economics has a very crisp and historically accurate definition of how a credit bubble ends. According to Ludwig von Mises, there is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as a result of a voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system involved. This is a view I happen to ascribe to and explains my strong preference for placing my wealth out of the path of a potential dollar collapse. As a nation, we've undertaken desperate measures to avoid abandoning the continuation of our credit expansion, leaving a final catastrophe of the currency as our most likely outcome. As for the timing, it could hardly be worse. Dealing with a bursting housing bubble is hardly the sort of challenge we need at this particular moment in history, but here we are. The stewardship and vision displayed by the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. in bringing all of this about has been utterly atrocious. So, what can we expect from a collapsing credit bubble? Simply put, everything that fed upon and grew as a consequence of too much easy credit will collapse. I am especially leery of financial stocks, low-grade bonds, and of course, real estate. I see very few conventional ways to protect one's wealth, and so I invite you to begin asking yourself, and if you have one, your financial advisor, some very hard questions about the safety of your holdings. You'll be glad you did. Remember, this time it's probably not different. Please join us for the next chapter, where we will explore the extent to which we have been telling ourselves pleasant half-truths and other falsehoods, which I call fuzzy numbers. Thank you for listening.